Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Jaglinzer. I want to welcome all of you to our fourth in our series of Disinformation Summit webinars. I'll introduce our guests in a minute, but this is a topic around business risk of disinformation. I'm Alan Jaglinzer. I'm the professor of financial accounting and the director of the Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability at the Cambridge Judge Business School. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Mike Willis, who is the director of our Masters of Accounting program. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thanks, Alan.
So the concept for the Disinformation Summit, it's hosted by several organizations, both with Cambridge, with University of Notre Dame, University of Zurich, and we're reaching out across disciplines so that we can actually learn more about disinformation. My perspective is disinformation has become, and perhaps always has been, an accelerant for pretty much everything that is societally harmful. And so we convened a group of people across disciplines to try to understand, how does disinformation work? Why is it so effective? And what are the implications of it, which is one of the topics we're going to discuss tonight, and how can we potentially mitigate its impact? Just to give you some perspective, we have a global advisory board across disciplines and across everything from the World Economic Forum to multiple universities, where we go to psychologists and professors of public policy and leadership and management. I want to do a special shout out to one of my colleagues from Notre Dame, Brad Badisher, who actually introduced our guest to me. So Brad's out there listening, and thank you for introducing our guest. So tonight, our guest is Matt Gorham. He's the managing director at PwC Cyber and Privacy Innovation Institute, and they do, among other things, consulting in global cyber threat intelligence, risk and compliance, crisis management, and insider threats. Matt has extensive practical experience in all aspects of security and resiliency, including sensitive investigations, physical security, intelligence risk assessments, protective operations, technical risk mitigation, data protection, and critical incident management, which sounds like an actually really cool job. So I want to welcome you, Matt, for coming to us, and start off by basically asking you, how did you get into this role, and kind of give us a big picture about the issues and the risks with disinformation in a business climate?
Sure. Thanks for having me tonight. I appreciate that. Really came to this role over a number of years with the U.S. government. So I joined PwC about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And prior to that, I'd worked for the previous 25 plus years at the FBI. And my last job there was as assistant director of cyber. So in FBI speak, the person responsible for all FBI investigations and operations in cyber, both on the national security and the criminal side. And so obviously, over the course of the last few years, we've seen significant disinformation operations conducted by various nation states, and was part and parcel of my portfolio when I was in government. And then as I migrated to the private sector and was consulting both on the cyber threat side, but also the physical side, really began to look at some of the disinformation impact in the private sector, which is different than what I would necessarily see in the government sector, but certainly related. You know, as I think, thinking about it broadly, and I know we use different terms: disinformation, misinformation. I've seen malinformation. Maybe probably a good place to start would really be defining those terms up front, so when I'm using them, everybody knows what exactly I mean when I say it. And so I use information very much in the way the U.S. government would. That is, intentionally false or misleading information to have some impact or effect. And misinformation, which could be true or could be false. It could be true out of context, but it misinforms unintentionally. And so that's really, it's the motive behind the two that in large part separates them. I generally don't use the term malinformation, but I know a lot of folks do use that term. So I think, from a business context, what I've seen since I've been here is it's a threat, but it hasn't fully manifested in terms of in something that business is dealing with each and every day. And so, but it's something that I think businesses should be thinking about. We've seen some examples. We've seen information released sometimes by activists, sometimes by nation states, sometimes by other companies that have had an impact. And I really, when you think about, okay, what as a company, how should we be thinking about the potential of the threat? What kind of action should we be taking today? And I really think, from my perspective, it comes down to four broad things as a corporate entity. First is really understanding and having that social media monitoring, understanding what your reputation out there is, the things that are be talking about in terms of your company. Secondly, I think a threat assessment, really understanding how are we vulnerable to this kind of impact if a disinformation event were to take place. I think the key to all of it is, as I look at it in the private sector, though, is really about your brand presence. I think to me, the key thing a company can do now before an incident were to occur really is to know and live your brand or corporate values, and ensure that you have a strong brand recognition, that people know who you are, what your values are, and that really goes a long way. It's probably your best defense. But ultimately, these events do happen, and so having a recovery plan, kind of thinking through what does that look like, having an issues register that say, hey, these are issues that could come up, kind of scenario planning. I think those are the four things, even though this threat hasn't manifested in the private sector as robustly as it has kind of in society as a whole. Those are four things that I think I would want to be doing as a private sector entity these days in preparation for this type of activity in the future.
Thanks, Matt. So could you just describe maybe some examples of how some of these disinformation initiatives might be carried out? What might this typically look like?
Yeah, I think, and I'll use a couple of anonymized examples, but, you have, there was a particular chip company that was, information was put out that the merger between two particular chip companies was problematic and it would be under government scrutiny, which then resulted in a tumbling of stock prices on both entities. We've seen it in a coffee company that information was put out about that company's activities that was clearly fraudulent, again, caused backlash by a political leaning group. We've seen a number of cases of activists putting out information about a particular company's business models that were completely inaccurate. They drew lots of attention. And all of these that I'm describing are in the realm of disinformation, but then that disinformation takes a life of its own and then results in misinformation beyond that as well.
And are you finding boards and corporate executives are actually calling you up more frequently, or is it something that they're way behind the curve on right now?
I actually think we're pretty far behind in terms of recognizing it as a threat and potential for most companies. I think it kind of falls in a subset of kind of crisis management and strategic communications that, hey, if something like this happens, we'll respond like we would for any other crisis. And I do think that companies and boards are struggling to come up with those use cases that would demand action in the short term. Because I think as you think about it, it's probably two ends of the spectrum where the threat is most likely to manifest. That is on the activist side, putting information out about a particular company, or on the nation state side. But that kind of middle ground where you would have two companies engaging in disinformation and for competitive advantage, I think is less likely. And I think, everyone's concerned about that, but I just, there's not a lot of use cases that I think then get boards and management to engage and start to spend money and resources towards some type of defense in that space. But as I mentioned, those four things that I described, they aren't generally very expensive to do. You can work through those types of things. Planning and exercising is something that does make you much more resilient. And so while the threat hasn't manifested and there aren't as many kind of commercial on commercial use cases, I do think it's worth the investment, but I just haven't seen the kind of demand signal from either boards or management with respect to disinformation as a threat purely in the commercial sector.
So Matt, how would you suggest that boards start to assess the risk of disinformation? What kinds of things should they be thinking about, and how might they make a determination about the risk in their organization?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost is knowing yourself. What about our brand is core to who we are and what we do? And then looking at the threat actors out there from an analytical perspective. So this is who we are, who has motive or agenda as it relates to who and what we do. And then setting a team up to just methodically go through that and analyze, okay, how could that be at risk? What are the things that really could degrade our brand? And then what are the answers back to that? And so think that through. Sometimes it requires some imagination because you're very proud of your brand and the things that you make and do. But think from a completely opposite direction. What are those things that could go out there that really hurt that? And then what are the stories, kind of data-driven stories that you're going to tell to fight that if it were to actually happen? Much harder to debunk than it is to work on the front end to have that very strong brand. But I think both of those things are important. Both working on your brand, going back to my point of know and live who you are as a corporate entity. Really ensure that you have that strong brand and everybody knows who you are at heart. And then plan for those that don't share your view or would be likely to do something. Who are they? What are they doing? Actively monitoring to ensure that you know what the reputation looks like in social media. And then being prepared to act with that data-driven storytelling and response should it occur.
So can you speak a little bit to the kinds of actors? If I were doing a scenario analysis, I mean, one of the scenarios you discussed was short sellers, maybe who are trying to, gain something from the stock market. But how predictable can you run these scenarios? Because if I were Disney, for example, I would not have naturally expected to have issues with a state government, for example, or certain actors in the state government. So how do you go about thinking about who are the actors in the space and planning for each?
Yeah, and it is becoming increasingly difficult as we live in a more and more polarized world, both internationally and in the domestic U.S. space. So I think, again, starting with who are we? What do we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? And then, really working through the potential scenarios. I actually, if I think in the Disney scenario, thinking through what would be a likely result of some of that, I do think that's difficult to do. But those are the crazy times we live in today, where things again take a life of their own and expand very quickly. Which is why I think, running through those scenarios on the front end is necessary, but isn't sufficient. It's really when something does happen, how are we going to be resilient to respond? And again, with that, and I can't emphasize enough that data-driven storytelling. So actually what you're seeing is not this, it's this. Here's the data that supports that. Here's the narrative that goes with it. And I think, to your point, it's hard sometimes to predict what those things are. Disinformation, takes a life of its own. It's not always, if you sit around rationally and think about it on the front end, you're not always going to predict what's going to go viral. And so, building the resilience to deal with whatever that is, I think is important. And as you scenario plan, it'll make you stronger across the board. So I think, doing those exercises, doing that scenario plan, even if you don't get it exactly right in terms of what the disinformation actually is, it'll still better prepare you for the actual incident when it does occur. And I do think it's important to think through that, because while we don't see a ton of examples of it now, I do think, we're going to see more in the private sector in the time to come. I think the ability of platforms to amplify the message at such volumes that we've never seen before. I think technology, particularly around deep fakes and what that brings to the equation, is also going to be a game changer in the years to come. And so I can see this continuing to kind of escalate over time, even though, again, we're not seeing as many examples of it in the short term.
So on that note, Matt, are you seeing now any particular trends or indications that certain industries or businesses or types of organizations might be targeted more than others? And do you foresee that going in a particular direction?
I haven't seen any trends, because honestly, the volume of data out there on these is insufficient to really kind of do any good trend analysis. We just haven't seen enough examples that have been brought to light for us to do the analysis on. I do think, particularly as ESG issues become more and more prevalent, and we start to see information and demands on ESG and compliance with those goals, I would expect to see a lot more activity in that space as well. And I think that goes to, as a company, knowing who you are, knowing what your values are, and living them, so you don't have that disconnect between who you say you are and the reality of the situation. I think companies have become much more vocal recently on particularly those ESG goals, and to the extent that they're doing that, making sure they're living up to the goals and expectations that are setting, I think is really important for companies to think through.
So revisiting one of your comments, you mentioned that a lot of this resilience is based off of knowing your company brand and pushing that out there consistently. But what about earlier stage companies? I would imagine that they're most vulnerable in this context, and they don't have the opportunity to build up the trust and the brand recognition. And then I'm going to go to the audience and piggyback on this. Should they, or other corporations, or when should they be thinking about bringing in advisory services like PwC versus building internal capabilities?
I think it's a mix of both, and I think companies should be thinking about this risk from the beginning. When you're agile, when you're small, when you have the ability to set out a kind of roadmap of how you're going to build that brand early on, will go a long way to ensuring that capacity is kind of built in. If you think about kind of the really large companies of today, how much work have they done in terms of disinformation, and how much more difficult in a large organization that has decades of kind of muscle memory in other spaces, how much more difficult is it for them than the very agile, nimble startup who can really bake that into the front end? In terms of when would you bring somebody in, when would you do it yourself? I think it comes down to, do you have the right expertise and bandwidth internally to do it? And if you do, that's great. If you don't, it's definitely something you want to think through, and maybe you bring in some outside expertise to help you navigate that. And so I think that's a situation dependent question.
Yeah, I'm hearing this theme from you that a key sort of part of defense is cultivating a reputation and kind of seeding the public, right, with a brand and information about your business. But in thinking about risks, should companies, this question from the audience, should companies be thinking about not only risk to the brand and the company overall, but preparing for risks that potentially related to individual actors within the firm and their reputations?
Yeah, I think the two areas that could significantly impact a business. One is what I'll call just generically the celebrity CEO. That is somebody in the organization that has a very high public profile, is closely associated with groups or causes that have, lack of a better term, adversaries in the world. And I think those individuals then potentially not only draw the attention of some of those engaged in disinformation, but in fact, put at risk the company potentially as well. And I think the other piece of that, and I'll go beyond the CEO and say, the extended family and executives, there's a, thinking through what all of that looks like, I think is important. The other piece of that is companies that, again, take a very public stance on a social issue or a political issue are generally running the risk. And I'm not saying putting no particular value judgment on going one direction or other, but understanding what that risk looks like. So if you're a company that has a social political position on something, it's not to say you shouldn't have it. It's not to say it's not the right position for your company, but you should definitely think through what is the countervailing narrative associated with this. And if disinformation or misinformation regarding this were to come out, would we be prepared to deal with it? And so, again, agnostic on stances, but certainly taking a stance when you have that responsibility for an organization requires you to think through the possible consequences of that ahead of time.
Do you have any thoughts on how to inoculate against some of the executives? Because there is, particularly in some of the more creative industries, and tech is one I'm thinking of, and there's a particular chaos agent out there in tech right now. How do you inoculate on that if you're worried about their behavior and its effect and its transmission out into disinformation?
Yeah, I think you're going to have very visible executives that you're not going to change their style. They've gotten to where they are in life by being who they are. But what you can do on the margins, is think about their security posture, right? So we do a lot of work with high net worth individuals that maybe haven't thought through some of the potential risk associated. And again, agnostic on their view, stance, public statement on any particular issue. But if you're going to do that, have you thought through the physical and virtual risk associated with that? So, for example, are you susceptible to having your email stolen? What does your schedule look like? Because all the information that's out there and available creates an opportunity for disinformation. And so I think, to me, it's really about understanding what that presence looks like, that public presence. How secure are you, both physically and virtually? And do a lot of work with that. And what I found is over time is having those conversations ahead of time with the approach being, we know you have a style and you have a quality and manner of life that isn't going to change. However, here are some things you can do to help mitigate some of the risk associated with it. And it's generally, I found people to be very receptive about that. Then obviously you can, from a security perspective, completely lock down someone's life. But at that point in time, generally the principal you're trying to help is no longer interested in being helped and is going to revert. So it's not about changing what they do. It's about changing the security around what they do that allows them to do the things they want without incurring some of the potential risk. And I think that's something that more and more executives are seeing as, you've seen what I'll call doxing of individuals, collecting a lot of information, putting that out on the internet. We've seen hacks, particularly from the kind of hacktivist community, releasing lots of personal data or corporate data related to individuals. So thinking through, how you could change your security posture on the front end, I think is something that we should think broadly in terms of executives and boards, particularly those high profile and high net worth individuals.
So question from the audience. When we're thinking about media through which disinformation might travel, and particularly social media platforms, we could see some change in that landscape. For example, Twitter going private versus being a public company. Does that change the risk landscape and potentially open up more different opportunities for disinformation?
Yeah, I think one thing to think through, and if I certainly saw this when I was in government, and I think from a private sector kind of brand monitoring and understanding of the platforms, what could change is the terms of service. And I think it's essential to understand what the terms of service of the various platforms where you may think that disinformation will be propagated are, and knowing what they are ahead of time so that you can go to those companies and have the right information in the right format addressing the terms of service, because that's oftentimes how you can, not that you can completely mitigate the activity once it's taking place, but one of the ways that you can do that is by having the content removed or curtailed in some way. And if you don't understand the terms of service that would allow companies to do that, then I think it becomes more difficult. And so could the change in Twitter, for example, change the way the company has terms of use? And I guess the answer is yes. And so I think both changes in terms of use as well as companies, as they're doing that kind of social media monitoring and threat assessment, really thinking through, okay, here are the major platforms that we're looking at. Here's their terms of service. Here's where we can say this kind of content doesn't fit the terms of service, and therefore we're asking this to be removed. Really understanding that and doing some good solid work ahead of time goes a long way from at the time of the actual incident, because as in any crisis, the last thing you want to be doing is kind of exchanging business cards and figuring out each other's equities in the middle of the crisis. You want that done well ahead of time, and so I think that's some of the preparatory work that is absolutely required.
On a related note, do you have any thoughts about the need for liability from the liability coverage, legal liability from the dissemination providers, the platforms themselves?
Yeah, and I think there's a huge debate in the U.S. Around Section 230, and I don't know where that debate's going to go, and I'll probably take a step back just because I was in government when a lot of that discussion was going on. But I think really understanding how platforms, and if we look at platforms, I mean, the world's biggest companies these days are platforms, and understanding how the liability rests there, I think, is something that as free and open societies, we're going to have to wrestle with, because it's I do think kind of at the more macro level, the things that we value as free and open societies in some respects are in jeopardy as a result of where we are today. And so, a lot more to wrestle with in terms of that space.
You mentioned Section 230. Could you just, for those of us who might not be familiar with that, could you just give an overview of what that means and the implications of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the gist of it is those platform companies that have carried that content, providing they're doing kind of general due diligence, aren't responsible for the validity of that content that's out there. And so I think that's created a situation where content moderation is not something that has kind of been baked into the system as we've gone along. And look, it's a tension, right? It's the tension between free speech and the ability to put content on there, government interaction versus the private sector. In whose mind something may get moderated. I mean, these are societal debates that unfortunately we're struggling with in the U.S. for sure. And in terms of our current polarization in the U.S. and U.S. society is making it more difficult. And so I think we'll be struggling with that for some time to come.
I was going to ask if you had an opinion about shielding disinformation behind a free speech. You've got in America the First Amendment rights, which I support obviously, but shielding disinformation behind it, because I take that to an extreme, and I sit down and I think in terms of what we do, which is financial reporting, and we have a very strict infrastructure for that. And you can't just say anything in that environment where you can be litigated or even criminal penalties from an enforcement regulator. So at what point does free speech rights, at what point should we take that step back maybe before we go into and allowing disinformation to manifest? Where's the line on that?
If I wish I knew where that line was and we could all get there more quickly, but the Supreme Court case, right? You have free speech, but you can't run into the movie theater and scream fire and thereby cause a panic and cause harm. And so what is the disinformation equivalent of, screaming fire in the crowded movie theater is something that we're still wrestling with. And we see it play out in society. We've seen it. We've struggled with it in the U.S. in terms of elections. We've seen it in terms of other societal concerns, and I don't know where that line is. And unfortunately, I don't think society, at least in the U.S. context, is decided where that line is. And ultimately, we can, as practitioners in the space, highlight examples of where we think a particular line on a particular case is, but until we come to a consensus societally, I think we're going to have a really hard time. When I sat in government, you thought about disinformation. There's not a foreign, it's not a foreign nexus. It's U.S. citizens, intentionally or unintentionally continuing to propagate a mis or disinformation. Government's not the arbitrator of that, and in fact, the First Amendment and other for other reasons, the government's not engaged in it. Now, there are things government can do when it poses that risk to life, and so that's a balance in the government space. But I really do think we need to struggle as a society and come up with that understanding of what's acceptable, and it's caught up in so many other things at the time that I believe, and my personal opinion is, we're years and years of struggle away from kind of redefining what that line looks like. I think we're not and haven't been prepared to really understand the change in dynamics in terms of the speed of an acceleration of information that can be out there, the types of information that are out there that are held in the private sector by virtue of the digitalization of the world. So I do think there's a lot of, again, keep harping back to, we really have to have those dialogues as society. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, that polarization and that process that we're trying to wrestle with is causing it to be a difficult conversation to have. And so you're kind of caught in that dilemma that we need to have the conversation to solve this, but we can't solve it because we can't have the conversation. And that's why I think, I'm optimistic that we as a society will get there, but pessimistic that we'll get there very quickly.
I'm going to quick follow up, because the reason why I ask that is I'm fascinated as I get into this space more that we have this infrastructure in financial reporting that is very solid, that is preventative, arguably, on disinformation that could roil markets or create fraudulent scenarios, and yet we can't get any kind of an analog elsewhere. And I also see, for example, Elon Musk challenging his ability to say whatever he wants to say in a financial markets context by taking that through the court system under a First Amendment right. So I'm wondering, at what point do we lose what we have in financial reporting under the First Amendment? And I don't know that you have an answer for that. That was more of a comment.
I don't, but I know exactly where you're going in terms of the drift of that and our ability to to ensure those safeguards are in place, investor transparency, understanding the things that the financial system is kind of bedrock to the financial system. And I do worry about that as well. I don't know that that's we'll get to that point where we lose that, but I certainly think it's something we should be paying attention to and really understanding where that kind of drift to, on the far end of the spectrum. I can say anything I want to say, true or untrue, whenever I want to say it. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I don't think in the U.S. context we've ever really been there. I think that's a newer narrative in the public consciousness as of late, and so I do worry about what that portends for society moving forward.
So I have a question that kind of relates to your investigative background, Matt. In some of the popular coverage around disinformation efforts, there's been some discussion around so-called disinformation for hire firms, companies that might specialize in these type of things. So for a particular incident, maybe one that's deemed to be unacceptable or even illegal, can these be investigated? Is the expected benefit of investigating a disinformation incident justify the cost?
Yeah, so I think it depends. So can it be investigated? Yes. And those firms, criminal organizations, depending on your perspective at any given time, that engage in that disinformation as a service, you can go out there and purchase anything from, likes on a LinkedIn page all the way up to, treatises on companies and full on, disinformation propagation with botnets and the like. You can probably get, some likes for, $10, and you can, spend hundreds of $1,000s on the top end to have full on campaigns to pull something down. This is in the realm of both government in the national security space, intelligence organizations conducting that type of activity, all the way through to the criminal marketplaces that sell that. Now, can you investigate it? You certainly could. Could potentially some of those service providers, depending on the nature of the disinformation and what law might have been or could have been violated, also be caught up in that? Absolutely. I think it's difficult to say, is it worth the investment? I think if you're a company and this disinformation campaign is posing an existential threat to your business as a result of that disinformation campaign, then the answer to that's absolutely yes from their perspective. And would I, as that company, be advocating for all the government assistance in terms of investigating that I could get? I absolutely would. But it's always that balance: is this a criminal disinformation campaign, or is it just disinformation? Is it First Amendment protected activity? And from an investigative side and the government side, and those are difficult questions to navigate each and every time, and they are so case specific. But I do think, again, societally, we have to address those. Just like I think, corporate entities today have to think through the possible scenarios and prepare for disinformation and misinformation. I think government, working with the victims, needs to continue to work those where it is permissible to work those, because we're going to be, again, wrestling with these kinds of issues in the years to come, just given the technology and the acceleration of the information that's out there today.
So Matt, I have kind of a more organic question. So if, besides kind of the reputation management stuff that you discussed, with respect to mitigating this. Are there any other macro level discussions they're having, like even lobbying, or trying to get Congress to change laws on disinformation, or even can we collectively get a higher bid for Twitter than the current one that's out there because we're concerned where that's going? Or are corporate execs and board members, should they be? If they're not, are they having these types of conversations at a macro level?
Yeah, I don't think we're seeing those conversations happen in the volume I wish they would have happen. Kind of when I look at disinformation generally in the private sector, I do feel like we're behind. And I think that comes down to we just don't have as many use cases and examples to put forward that cause executives and boards to say, I see risks that I need mitigated. And so we're in that that in-between land between significant threat. We're going to apply resources to both prevent it and be resilient against it. We're not quite to that point, and we're in there's a threat. There's something out there. We should maybe think about it. And so I haven't seen that dynamic action or call to action in terms of legislation or preparation, security, cybersecurity, kind of baking it into risk assessments more broadly, and has generally been treated as a subset of crisis management. Being aware of kind of brand management and understanding it, but I haven't seen it get the attention that I would have expected. And coming from government, where it was certainly something that I would see quite often, and from a nation state perspective, coming to the private sector, did not see the same level of interest awareness of the threat than I would have expected.
Is that something that we should build in this Disinformation Summit? Is that something that we could create where we do kind of our end and we do an add-on for CEOs and board members so that they're actually alerted to this, where we could collaborate and say, hey, we should be having macro level discussions? Because I'd be happy to build.
Yeah, I actually think it is, because when I look at this threat, and again, I've come from this threat from a government-centric view, so I've seen how corrosive and how dangerous that threat is. And I do think, again, not that I would expect two companies to be engaged in disinformation campaigns. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about activists, criminal organizations being able to manipulate it on one end, and nation states on the other. Particularly, one could make the argument that maybe we've seen the zenith of globalization for the near future. And if we're going to kind of fracture, and we're going to kind of go back to, for lack of a better term, great power competition, and I'm going to expect the nation state threat side to increase. And the fact of the matter is the private sector is caught in that competitive space. Just like they're caught in cyber, they're caught when it comes to disinformation. And so I would expect the nation state, hostile state activity to continue robustly. I think as criminals really become more adept at manipulating the disinformation, I don't think that that there isn't a desire to do it, that there isn't a market for it. It just hasn't manifested in a way that they've been able to do it at scale. And so I do, to your question directly, yes, I do think it's really important to provide that narrative of, hey, here's the risk, here's the potential, here's the things you should be thinking about now. So, much like we are in cybersecurity these days, well behind the curve, like here's a threat that we see as a looming threat. It's something that's out there. Everything says that nation states will continue to engage in this activity, and it'll only get more significant and rise. The criminals go where the money is. Criminals figure out a way to manipulate the latest technology. They're not there yet, but they're coming. And so I do think there is a call to action there. So incorporating that, so chief risk officers, CEOs, COOs are tracking and understanding that risk, I think is a really good thing.
So you made a connection a couple of times there during this conversation with cyber risk and sort of more traditional cyber risk as we think about it. And when we think about that space, a firm can test its defenses, right? You can bring in someone to try to penetrate the security through social engineering or whatever. But is there an analog for testing resilience against disinformation? I mean, certainly you would want to put public information out, but how do we think about that?
Yeah, I guess the corollary is to pen testing is, polling group sentiment analysis. So, do you bring the group in to run through scenarios? Would you believe this? What do you think about this? I think there are some things that you can do in that space. I think, again, going back to the kind of the basic four things that I said, that's helping prepare you, and you can do that as part of that analytical threat research too. These are who might be interested in doing something. These are the kinds of things they might do. Let's get that polling group together and let's run some of these scenarios by them. Would you be inclined to believe this? Would you be inclined to believe that? What would you need to hear to make you think that what you heard wasn't true? So I do think it's not a well-established process, but there's probably some things that can be done out there. On your point about the connection between cyber, I think in some respects, that's the confluence of activity I really worry about. That is cyber activity as it relates to disinformation. So imagine kind of your traditional hack and dump operation. So a company aligned with a government, that an adversarial government has determined in their worldview that anything that diminishes my adversary increases my position geopolitically, and we can pick a country that might fit. And so the company aligned with the other government has their email holdings dumped on the internet for all to see, and they're peppered with false and fraudulent information, and the stock price starts plummeting. How long does it take that company to understand what's driving that stock price? Actually isn't even their data. It's that false and fraudulent information. And so have companies gone through the preparation to deal with the nexus? I actually think that's the most compelling use case when it comes to what do we need to do to understand our vulnerability in this space. The problem with it is it's probably it's a small subset of the companies that could be vulnerable to it. And so I think a lot of companies would say, well, that actually wouldn't happen to me because I won't be the subject of that kind of hack and dump and disinformation. But that really is the very significant threat and manifestation of those two, the confluence of those two things.
We have a question with respect to misinformation relative to disinformation. Which one's a higher risk for companies? And do they take different strategies on that, or is it fundamentally the same?
So I think you have to look at it holistically. I do think both are significant issues. I actually think misinformation is a more addressable issue in the short term. And what I mean by that is if it's just information that was put out of context or taken out of context, or information that someone believed, there's not motive behind it, that fact-based storytelling in response to it is more likely to help you recover from that than with disinformation. And what I mean by that is the intentional disinformation is something that is very targeted, has been thought through, and so I think is actually a more pernicious issue. Both are significant and both can manifest and both lead to the other. So I do think at the end of the day, you got to look at them holistically and not in isolation, because you can imagine a deliberate disinformation campaign spinning off kind of unintentional or misinformation, and vice versa, that nefarious actors see a misinformation out there and then devise a significant disinformation campaign around it that just piggybacks on already unintentional but misleading information that's out there. So my advice would be for everyone to look at them holistically and not to say I'm worried about one or the other.
Speaking of response, Matt, just in general terms, if you were advising a firm that needed to respond to a disinformation event, whether it was product related or reputation related or share price manipulation, whatever, if they're responding, how would you propose they begin to think about responding to an event like this?
So I think first and foremost is understanding what's out there. I think that's the first piece, and how that's likely to propagate. Because if you're trying to debunk a disinformation campaign, it's probably the hardest thing that's out there, right? You're hoping that your brand reputation, all the work you did ahead of time, will help with that. But it's understanding what's out there, understanding hopefully why it's being driven or what's behind driving it, and then sitting down to think, what is that counter narrative? Again, that fact-based storytelling to get out there as part of your crisis communications plan to try to get in front of it. And I think you may need analytical help with that, and it's all depending on who the victim is. But do you have the right analytical resources? Do you have the right understanding of how this message is propagating? Again, have you done the work ahead of time to know what the terms of service, terms of use are on these various platforms? Do you have the relationships in place to facilitate that? Do you need to bring somebody in to do that for you because you don't have that? Those are all things that, again, the more work you do ahead of time, the easier that crisis will be. But it's going to be difficult because, as we've all seen, these messages go viral. They're very difficult to debunk. You will never fully debunk it, and so it's a question of, how do you counter message that at the same time taking those actions that you can, to the extent that you can, to get content removed to try to mitigate the propagation of the disinformation.
So we typically see an audience of what I call the next generation of business leaders. So I guess anywhere from age 19 all the way to mid 40s. Do you have any ideas on what we should be putting in our curriculum to prepare them? And also, how should they be engaged in social media?
Yeah, I guess, I think for me, the first and foremost, I think the business leaders of today that are students should be thinking about data, both the incredible potential of the use of data from a business perspective, but also the dangers of data from a societal perspective and where those two things meet. And as a business person, how does your use of data engender trust? And how could that trust be eroded? We're living in times, particularly in the U.S., where trust in government, trust in many quarters has eroded. To some extent, business hasn't eroded as much as others, and so I think we're at a very fragile time in society that business really has to continue to build that trust and kind of protecting the data, using the data in an ethical way, being transparent around the use of data, being able to utilize that data for the good of society and for the organization, I think is important. But as one of the things I would say that I really would encourage all young and aspiring business folks to look at is around trust in data. Do we need to fundamentally disrupt the ecosystem? Like, do we have to, from a U.S. and perspective, we've worried for a couple of centuries around encroachment of government and into our lives. And really, how much does the business community now have in potential encroachment with all the collection? And so I think because businesses still has both a position and responsibility of trust, and because we haven't fundamentally wrestled with the data, the trust, and the use of it. I think anything in the curriculum that, fosters that discussion around what right looks like in terms of the data use and the data protection and the building of trust, I think is something that'll serve us well as those aspiring businessmen and women move up into organizations, and whatever the new paradigm is, that they help shape that in the future.
So conscious of time here, but I want to ask something completely unfair, which is to ask you to speculate wildly. If we were to sit down again in 5 years and revisit this topic of disinformation in this corporate setting, what would we be talking about? What would be different?
I'll give you my hopeful answer and then my pessimistic answer, I guess. So my my hopeful answer is societies as a whole will be less polarized, that will have wrestled with some of those fundamental questions around disinformation and where is that line about yelling fire in the crowded theater, so that we can not stop, but mitigate some of the corrosive effects of dis and misinformation. And as a society, we've come to some level of consensus. I'm pessimistic because you use the 5-year time horizon and not a 10. And I think we're going to be on the far side of 10 before we get to and I don't think we'll ever get to the perfect space. The society never gets to the perfect space, but I would expect us to continue to make progress. But I think progress is going to be slow and fleeting in the next couple of years. But I would like to get to that point and then say, if I expanded it out to 10 years, that I think we can maybe start to get there. And until we do that, so much of what's happening in the space is anathema to a free and open society. It's veiled in and often couched in terms of it's all about freedom of speech and it's about a free and open society, but at the same time, it's having a corrosive effect on a free and open society. And a free and open society needs to be able to trust the information, and it needs information to make good decisions about governance and the way and how we live. And so, I think it's the danger of the next generation is both wrestling with this and hopefully getting us to a point where there is consensus.
I couldn't agree more. So I genuinely appreciate your participation. Is there a place where people can find you if they want to?
Yeah, after all these years in government, I never had a social media account, but I am on LinkedIn now as a work related burden. So I am on LinkedIn under Matt Gorham. I'm happy to hear from anybody if they'd like to have a more in-depth conversation about anything.
Great. Well, thank you for your participation, and I'll reach back out to you about that idea that we talked about earlier. And I want to thank the attendees for coming and make a quick announcement about our next webinar, which will be Monday, the 23rd of May at the same time, which is 7 p.m. UK. And we'll be having a conversation with Dr. Emma Bryant, who is an associate researcher in the Human Rights Program at Bard College and has recently joined our Cambridge Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability as an affiliate, and her research is on these networks. So she's actually trying to identify and map out the disinformation for profit organizations. Who are they? Who's sponsoring them? And basically looking at the business side of disinformation. And she's testified in many governments, including UK Parliament, EU Parliament, Canada, US Congress. She was also helped expose Cambridge Analytica, and she advised the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. So again, I want to thank you, Matt, for joining us. Thank everybody for joining us, and everybody stay well. If you have any other suggestions for speakers, feel free to email me. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you this evening. Stay well, everybody. Thank you again, Matt.
Thanks.
And thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you. Take care.